Welcome to Matura Express. Today we'll be talking about how to give a proper conclusion. So I'm sorry for the technical errors. So I'll give you a short overview on what we'll do today. So first we are going to talk about we still need to adjust to the system because we have so many buttons and everything else to turn on, to turn off. So sorry, I think it just maybe we'll work it out someday. Okay, so first we are going to talk about, I'm going to put that, it's been in the Sicht, we're going to talk about why do we actually need a conclusion. A conclusion. By the way, the verb is to conclude. Then, so first, why do we need a conclusion will be just a short part. Then we're going to look at some phrases which you may use, for example, to sum up, to conclude, in conclusion, as a summary, and so on. And then I have 2 articles for you, and we'll see how's it going with the time. And I think they give a proper instruction on how to give a conclusion, and I think they're very interesting, and you can use them, of course, for your exam or to prepare for something. Okay, maybe we look at one or both of them, at both of them. Okay, so now first I would like to start. I'm just going to switch to a new tab. First, why do we need conclusion? Need of conclusion. So in general, if you don't know, conclusion is Zusammenfassung in German. So I'm just going to write that down in case you know. So the main thing, or the main reason why we conclude something is to reiterate what we said before. For example, okay, you're in your Matura exams or your Matura exam in English, and you have prepared well, and first you give an introduction, of course, so I'm going to give you an overview on that also. So introduction, which is basically about what your topic is going to be about. Then you have your main part or your main arguments. And then you have your conclusion. So a conclusion can either be a part of a presentation or of a speech. And on the other hand, or it can also be in an essay, for example, where it's very common to write a conclusion. But it's also important when you're giving a presentation. So as I mentioned, you have the introduction, the main arguments, and the conclusion. And the reason why we have a conclusion, as I already mentioned, is to reiterate your main arguments, which means you say them once more. You try to reinforce your point of view. For example, if our topic for today is tolerance, and you listed a few arguments that tolerance is important as it helps people to be more open-minded. It helps cultures living together more peacefully, and so on. And then in your conclusion, you try to paraphrase what you said in your main arguments in other words. Okay, so it's a factor of reiteration or repetition, which is basically the same. So those are synonyms. Repetition. So, but it's not only a repetition, it's also about raising questions, giving an input in your listener's brain, raising questions. Giving an input. So this is an A, raising questions. I'm trying to write more readable for you. Raising questions, giving an input. Conclusions are also very important if you want to give an outlook on the future. Outlook on the future. For example, when we get back to discrimination or intolerance, well, you could say that. For example, discrimination is something which should not be tolerated and which should be fought by knowledge, which is very important for our future, as we need to be more open-minded and more empathetic with people around us, which then may improve our future, our community. I'm just trying to think of another example. You could say that, okay, although tolerance is very important and is taught a lot in schools, for example, why is there still so much discrimination and intolerance towards, for example, minorities? So you could also lead your listeners into the direction where they really critically reflect on something. So to make, by posing a question which should lead the listener to really critically reflect on something and to question something which is considered a norm, for example. So to critically reflect on something. So this may be mostly used in controversial topics. Okay, so I think the last point I would like to mention, what's the function of a conclusion, is that you really want to round up your presentation. So it's kind of like, if you only list your introduction and the main arguments, you still think, was that all? Something is missing. So I think the audience wants you to quickly, briefly sum up your main points, your introduction, and maybe also an outlook on the future. So I think it's really important because it shows which of the main points were the most important for you, which you would like to mention again. Of course, you should sum up all of them, but sometimes that would be too long. For example, if you give a speech of, I don't know, 1 hour, but in your A-level exam, I think it is possible to, you should repeat all of your main arguments, and then maybe you can try to specialize. But I would like to reinforce that this point sticks out more than others, and so on. And you can also really give your opinion on the outlook or a critical question. Okay, so just to to round up your speech. Okay, so I think conclusion has a lot of important functions, and I hope I listed most of them. So if you have any other suggestions why you should use a conclusion or which I left out, you of course are invited to write them in our comments. Okay, now I would like to give you some examples how to introduce your conclusion. So you know that there are always some signposts, or some phrases which grab the attention of the audience, and they will say, okay, now we're at the conclusion, or now we're at the first main point, for example, or now he's introducing the topic. For example, when you're at the main part of your arguments, you would say that, okay, firstly, secondly, thirdly, on the one hand, on the other. So the audience knows you're still in the main arguments. But when you start with words like these, I will show you, well, I will write some down. They know, okay, now you're already at the conclusion. So it also is a way to lead your audience through your presentation in order for them to know, okay, now he's at this stage and he will probably finish soon. Okay, then I'll write down some words for you. So, as can be seen, for example, which is rather used rarely after all. Generally speaking. Oh, and a hint, of course, also for your written exams. Of course, when you talk, you don't really hear that. Well, you may perceive a pause, but otherwise, when you write, you would always use a comma. For example, well, you actually can hear it when you're talking about it. Maybe, for example, generally speaking, I would say that. So you make a pause in between, which kind of indicates that there is a comma needed. Zum Beispiel. In fact, but I wouldn't use that too often. Well, you can use it, but it's not too common when it comes to conclusions. You would rather say, football is very popular. In fact, it is the most popular sport of all times. I don't know if it's true. I don't think it's true. It's also very subjective. But it was just an example. Okay. In fact, to sum up, so this is very, very common when talking about a conclusion or to give a conclusion in the final analysis. But back to sum up. I think when you use this word or this phrase, you're never in the wrong way, but still it's used very often. Maybe you could try to think of something else, which of course shouldn't be wrong. So, all things considered. All things, I would rather say aspects or arguments, because you know, things is very basic level, and in the Matura we try to speak an advanced level of English, B2. Aspects, arguments considered. So you can use either aspects or arguments, try to not use things that often. Okay. As shown above, in your written exams, comma, dot, dot, dot. In short, all in all, so given these points, so you see you have a big variety which ones to use. Of course, some are used more often than others. On balance, for the most part, altogether, some are used. Oh, all together. Oh, sorry. Spelling mistake. I'm just going to write it. Together. Okay, overall, and some of my examples, I think sum up was already on the list. I would say to conclude, which I was taught in school, and they are also very common. So, for example, to conclude, I think it's very important to raise awareness of discrimination, for example, in Austria, and to really try to educate people on how to help people which are discriminated against, and so on. So here's an example. To conclude, but also as a conclusion, or we already had to sum up as a summary. Okay. And maybe if later on through my presentation I can think of something else which is usually very common, I'll just point it out. So you have a very big variety what to use, how to introduce your conclusion, and I would like to reiterate what I said before. I think it's very important for your audience to be able to know where you are right now in your presentation, when to give special attention to your presentation, because, well, it's obvious sometimes your audience just drifts off, and through these signposts they see, okay, oh, now he's coming to a conclusion, now I have to pay attention again, because he reiterates or he rephrases his idea which was said before, and I really want to know that, because, okay, I was drifting off a little bit in the middle part. So it's really for your audience and also for you to have a structure in your presentation. Okay, good. Then we'll go on. I found an article on the internet and I think it was quite interesting. So I have two articles. So one will be about 9 tips to end a speech with a bang. And then I have I think it's a PDF document on the internet, how to give a conclusion. So we'll look at the first article, and then if we still have time left, we are going to look at the second. And now I would like to go through the article with you, and maybe I'll make some comments, or of course you can also make some comments in our chat if you have any suggestions or anything to add here. Okay, So, 9 tips to end a speech with a bang is the article, or in your case, your presentation. We get this back. So, as you can see here, first of all, you barely can see something because we're just going to start with the first 6 sentences. Ah, no?
Here.
This one? No. I'm just. How can I switch the presentation?
You could rechter Mausklick with your mouse.
Oh.
Rechter Mausklick eine und dann vielleicht irgendwie so einfach Taskleiste fixieren Vektor, oder? Nein, halt immer in die schwarze eine rechter Mausklick.
Ah nein, das ist nicht das Problem, das war das.
Aber
und
wenn
das
das weg ist, dann ist das auch weg, oder?
Ah, ich glaube, dass das im Internet heißt. Anyway, okay, I'm just going to read it for you. So, sorry. Okay, a good talk or public speech is like a good play, movie or song. It opens by arresting the listener's attention, develops point by point, and then ends strongly. So, you try to catch the audience attention. And yes, what they also mention here in the text is that it's most of the time it's your introduction and your conclusion which is remembered the most. So if you're, for example, in your main arguments, you say something, it will probably be not remembered as good as your introduction, so your first impression, and your conclusion, which really tries to hook the audience. Okay, so I think that the introduction, in my opinion, is the most important thing. Then we have the conclusion and then the main arguments. Of course, you, well, in your A-levels, you should of course pay also attention to your main arguments, which is also very important. But sometimes people forget when they're really stressed out. They forget about the introduction. To give a proper introduction, what will be the topic about, how they will present the topic, and how they will structure it. And they also often forget to include a conclusion, which is also very important, because after the main arguments, they feel so relieved that they're finished that they say, okay, and my last point is, thank you for your attention. So I know that it's in a stress situation, it's kind of hard to really try to talk as long, not as long as possible, but as long as you need to. And I know you really want to get it over with, but I think it just rounds up your presentation or your speech a lot when you include a conclusion. So your conclusion can maybe 5 or 6 sentences, and it will, in my opinion, be a way better presentation than without any kind of conclusion. Okay, so just a little side note. Okay, so the first point they introduce is that you should plan your closing remarks word for word. Well, although I think it's very important that you prepare your speech or your presentation for the A-levels, in my opinion, I do not really agree with the first argument, because in my opinion, you should really speak freely and the words should come to yourself. Of course, you should have keywords and your structure and so on. And okay, if you have, for example, a joke, you can write that down. Either, anyway, I would suggest that you take some notes, but don't write word for word. I don't think that's good, because when you're lost and you have your keywords, you know, okay, I was there, okay, I'll start, or I'll get on with, for example, discrimination in our school system. But when you have a whole text and you really get lost, first of all, you really have to search really, really long for your for the word you were looking for, and secondly, you fixate yourself so much on really saying the thing that is said on the text that if you get lost, it's very, very hard for you or difficult to find words. If you really want to say it like that, as it is. If you have only keywords or some short phrases, then I think it's easier for you. But you also have to practice that. So try to, before you have your A-levels, try to practice with a partner to just with some keywords to try to make a presentation or a speech. Okay. Which are also mentioned, so always end a speech with a call to action. First of all, I would like to comment on this video. Obviously it's a TED Talk, so I think it's very interesting to listen to it, and it may give you some short input, because I think you can also learn from people giving a presentation, okay, what was good about it, what was not so good, and so on. And here it focuses on the conclusion, and as I mentioned before, in the conclusion you could also give, or you can also ask a critically or a question which should raise critical awareness amongst your audience. So you could advise your audience to maybe do something better or to take care of something better. For example, next time when you're when you think you're discriminating against someone who is, for example, of a minority, you could just say or tell them to think about that. Why did you actually do that? Because discrimination is, of course, something you do active and on purpose, but also sometimes passive. So we have these kind of schemes in our head of people or stereotypes, and sometimes we really have to reflect on them. Okay, so then, sorry for the ads, no thanks. So, end a speech with a summary. So, I think it's very interesting as they wrote it here, because they said, tell them what you're going to tell them, then tell them what you told them. So, it's actually everything I said just before, and it puts everything very simple, and that's just that just helps. And I think it's in a funny way, but it's true. So first you tell them what you're going to do, then you tell them what you're doing or what you want to say, and then you tell them again in order for them to know what you told them. So okay, I like that. So it's basically a conclusion, as we already talked about. For those of you who really feel confident with telling a story, or with sharing a personal story maybe also, or from their own experience, I think it's a good point. Whereas although you give some examples during your main arguments, you can also include a short story or short anecdote in your conclusion, where, for example, you can illustrate a better outlook on the future, for example, by giving a short input by telling a story, for example. So you could, for example, when talking about tolerance or discrimination, you can tell about a story of a man who was, well, it's very stereotypical now, but of a man who always discriminated against others, for example, minorities, and then he has an encounter with a person of that minority, and then he really reflects on everything he did and thought about these people, and he realizes that, well, they're not so bad, and then he thinks of these people and why did he actually get into that thought construct that this minority is bad, or why he had such hatred towards them. And then he realizes, okay, these were just, I was discriminating them against them. And then he turned his life around, and he was way more open-minded towards other cultures, other social constructs and everything else. So you could include a short history, of course, if you still have time and if you think it fits. So I think that when telling a story or joke, you have to be kind of spontaneous, because it also depends on the moment and on the mood and how you present yourself. Of course, you need to have some sort of preparation, which is obvious. And to our next point, which I kind of mentioned already, make them laugh. You can either start, well, you can start with a joke, either in your introduction, in your main parts, or in your conclusion, where it fits. So I think the most important thing about jokes or some funny remarks is the timing, and it has to be spontaneous. Because if you plan ahead a joke 2 months before your presentation, I don't know. I don't think it could work out, but you're never sure. And it also depends on how you present yourself, I think. If you're a little bit you should be self-confident, I think, when telling a joke, or you should be at least be certain that you want to tell that joke, and I think it will work out just fine. So for example, okay, here for example he tells a really, really long joke. So in your presentation, I would say that you maybe just stick to 2 or 3 funny remarks, or just a short joke. Otherwise, if you read a whole page of jokes, I don't think it will work out fine, because at one hand it costs a lot of time, and at the other hand, well, when it's a very long joke and people don't really like it, I don't think that will influence your speech or your presentation in a positive way. So yeah, so making jokes, totally fine. You should do that. I encourage you to make jokes in your conclusion, but it should be spontaneous and, well, just try it. Okay, make it rhyme. Okay, I think we can quit that. And then we have close with inspiration. Well, as I already mentioned before, you could talk about giving a positive outlook on the future for your audience, or you could also tell them an inspiring history, which I mentioned before. Otherwise, what they also mention here is that you can also, of course, work with your pitch, or if you speak slowly or fast, so you can also change that, or your intonation, so which words to emphasize. But I would like to suggest, for example, that people be more open-minded and so on. Okay, and I think so. Let's go on to point 8. Make it clear that you're done. So I know it's very often used, but I think it's important to maybe thank your audience at the end of your presentation. So, on that note, I would like to thank you for your attention. So you could you could use another sentence and connect it with the for paying attention. Sorry. For example, at the end you wouldn't say thank you for your attention. You could, just as I mentioned before, or with that argument, or with that conclusion, or on that aspect, I would like to thank you for your attention, for example. So I wouldn't leave it as a single phrase or a single sentence. I would integrate it into the conclusion. So I think that would be good. I wouldn't say, okay, now that's the end of my presentation. Nah, doesn't sound too good. Or for example, as it's written here, well, that just about covers it. Thank you. Sounds very boring, I think. And of course, you don't really need to think of super duper phrases which include everything and sound super hilarious or are really great, but try to be maybe a little bit more spontaneous, creative when it comes to thanking your audience. And well, I don't think, oh sorry, let them applaud. I don't really think that in your Matura exam you will be having some applause. Sorry, I switched back. Okay, so that was it. Now we still do have time. I'm just going to give you a quick overview of the other article. Maybe they also have some good advice on how to give a conclusion. Well, I think we already talked about that a lot. I think I'm just going to mention the main points. So, the first point they mention is that you have to be original. So, try something different. Don't end with a question and answer session. I think the aspect they mention here is that it's really important to give the audience some kind of time limit. So, okay, you'll have about 2 or 3 minutes to reflect on the question I just asked you, discuss it with a neighbor maybe, and then we'll talk about it in plenum. Of course, what you could also do during your, after your presentation, of course you can ask some questions. You could also ask these questions during your presentation, for example, but I would not suggest you to do that during your A-levels. I think there will be some questions already from your audience after the presentation. So after having finished your presentation in the A-levels, your audience, also die Prüfer auf der Seite, so you have your teacher just in front of you, and on the left hand side or on the right hand side there will be, I think, 2 people listening to you, what you're saying, and after your presentation is finished you will be talking, or they will be asking you some questions, so you don't really need to think about that much. So you have to be passionate. So during your conclusion or in general your presentation or your A-level, you really need to see, okay, how is my audience reacting towards or to my presentation? Are they falling asleep? Are they, I don't know, playing with their hair? Are they eating something or whatever? So you could also maybe include here in that situation you could include a joke. Why not? for example, in your conclusion, you could include a question in order for them, okay, now I really have to think about what he just said. Okay. The next point I think is very important. So you have to be personal. If you want to, of course, you don't have to. If you want to, you can share a personal story. If it really fits into the topic, and you can tell your audience, yes, well, I already had an encounter which really fits into the topic right now, and as a conclusion, I would like to tell you something about that, or a story I read, or something else. So be personal. I think that's also to be personal, to be authentic, so to really be yourself and not try to force yourself to talk about something or to have an opinion on something which isn't yours. So of course you need to try to be objective when it comes to a topic, but otherwise, of course, you can add your opinion or your own personal story, but also try to critically reflect on that. So we always question everything. And the last point, yes, be clear. You should know which words to use. Of course, sometimes you don't really know the word right ahead, which happens the same. It's the same with me. So sometimes I don't know a word which is basic level, for example. Then try to, okay, excuse me, or try to paraphrase it. And especially in your, in your conclusion, try to be clear, to only list your main arguments, and then try to give an outlook or try to raise a question. Okay, so, well, could you switch me back to the full screen? Yeah, just 1 second. Okay, hello everybody. My hair is like everywhere. Well, so this was our presentation for today on how to give a conclusion. I hope you have a brief overview on how to, first of all, why do we need a conclusion? Which words or phrases can we use? And then which methods, or how can we include the conclusion, or how can we improve the conclusion? So I hope the stream was useful for you, and if you have any questions or remarks or whatever, you feel free to post them in our chat. Otherwise, thanks you for, okay, that was a bad conclusion. Otherwise, thank you for your attention, and I hope to see you soon.